Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Dev to Dev, the podcast about everyday video game developers and why they do what they do every day. This time it's an episode with someone I have worked with before, briefly, for a very fun time on Diablo. Again, somebody whose career was fascinating to dig into and learn more about. Brian Kindregan, now a creative director, someone who's been various different roles inside and outside of the games industry, which made for a fascinating conversation about his time in film as a storyboard artist and director, moving into games, moving back out of games, back into TV and film, and then moving back into games. He gives some great insight into the similarities and differences between the culture and processes of those two industries, so often considered very similar, but actually very different. Brian's worked on some fascinating games, some games that I dearly love, like Mass Effect 2 and many others. He's had a great career driving story and narrative, leading, directing stories and narratives, and ultimately directing whole projects. A storied career, someone that was great to learn more about. Someone whose career I think you can learn a lot from, both in terms of the way he approaches things, what he's learned from those roles at Ubisoft. So yeah, great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Hope you do too. As a reminder, Dev to Dev is on Patreon. You can catch all of Season 1 on Patreon and the video versions of Season 2 on Patreon. You can also catch us on all the socials. Please do like and share any clips or pieces that I post. I'd really appreciate sharing them amongst your friends. I really want this podcast to grow in the community, but also grow for people that are outside the industry and want to get in. I think there's some really good insight into the process of making games and what it's like to be a developer. That's one of my goals. But anyway, you know all that. I say it every week, but I appreciate everybody that does share and post and likes, and please join the Patreon if you can. It'll really help me out. But anyway, enough of my waffle, TM. Let's sit back and listen in to this episode of Dev to Dev, Season 2, Episode 5 with Brian Kindregan. Well, yeah, great to see you. We have worked together in the past, so this is not an entirely, hey, I don't know you episode like some of the previous ones in Season 2, but it was for a very brief period, and you've had a phenomenal career. So I'm really excited to kind of dig into your history. But I always open this with my favorite first question. What first inspired you about video games?
I think it was the interactive nature. So when I was young, I loved reading stories, and I just became, at a very young age, like a really obsessive reader of novels. And at a certain point, these games started coming out. They were the Infocom text adventures. And my dad was a professor, and he had a computer, but it had like a monochrome green screen. It couldn't handle any graphics at all. So that was the only thing I could play, but I was obsessed. You could run around a world, and this is going to sound really small, but like if you opened a door and you came back later, the door would still be open. You're like, I did that, So that got me really interested in games. At that time, I was also interested in storytelling and in drawing. And at that time, I really thought, and I think it was true, actually, that to work in games, you had to be a programmer. And I was great at English in school, and I was terrible at math. And I just thought, I love playing games, but that won't be something I work in. So like the Infocom games, I think were all written by ex-MIT guys. And I was like, I'm not getting into MIT. So I went into storyboarding for film, which was another way to tell stories, doing something that I thought I was okay at, which was drawing. So that I sort of had the inspiration, and then I had a whole other path that it was something I was also inspired by. And then I don't know if you want the full story of how I came around from film to games, or if you want to do that later.
For sure, yeah, I definitely want to get into that. Just to take a quick step back, like where did you grow up, and did you have any siblings that were into games as well?
I grew up in Boston, in kind of a working class Irish American neighborhood, and I had Irish American. I had siblings, of course. I had 3. They weren't really gamers, though. No. So I was kind of they all went on to become lawyers, right? So I was sort of the odd creative one, and I was the youngest as well. And I sort of grew up in a town or a neighborhood, and went to a high school where there was not really I didn't think there were a lot of people who were interested in reading. Like, I read science fiction and fantasy, and I really loved, imaginary worlds, and I kind of thought nobody else was interested in that stuff. My parents bought a copy of the first edition D&D game when I was a kid. It came in a box that looked like a board game. And I think my family opened it, and it was like not a board game, and everyone was kind of confused, and it just kind of went in a closet somewhere. And I read everything about it, but I was never in a D&D game as a kid because I didn't know who I could approach and be like, "Hey, you want to play this game with me?" Now on Facebook years later, I've discovered that some of the kids I went to high school with actually were really into, Star Wars and reading science fiction and fantasy and D&D and stuff like that. I just didn't know it, and nobody talked about it at school. So,
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, D&D feels like the perfect blend of storytelling and interactivity in one way. So yeah, fascinating you discovered it, but didn't quite get into it at the time.
Yeah, I have played it since, though, in case anyone's wondering.
And then so video games were kind of your thing, maybe not so much, a family thing, more your thing. And then did you have many friends at school that were gamers? You mentioned, not being quite sure about it. Did you have a group or any neighborhood kids or anything?
No. I had a couple of friends that I ended up trading fantasy novels with and science fiction novels. So I did have a small group that we would read books. But in terms of gaming, no, not really. Not until I went to university, where I went to California Institute of the Arts because I wanted to study animation and storyboarding. And so I started to meet people who were into games there. But even then, it was their secondary. They were there for film and animation, and those were the things they geeked out about. And they could talk about, Tex Avery and Chuck Jones and the Nine Old Men for many hours, and then sort of go like, oh yeah, games too, yeah. So it literally was not until I worked in games that I started to really be surrounded by people who were gamer first.
Interesting. So games were kind of a fun side hobby then, but animation and that form of storytelling, and then I guess moving coast as well. If you grew up on the East Coast and then moved over to the West Coast, you kind of had a big transition, to focus on that part of your life rather than games.
Yeah, I mean, the move part is definitely a big part of it. There was a little interstitial that I grew up in Boston. I served in the Army for a while, and then in the reserve while I was in school. And if you ever want cognitive dissonance, go serving in the Army Reserve and going to art school at the same time. It's pretty weird. But yeah, then the move to California, those were all really major life events. I wouldn't say that games were secondary in my life, though. I would just say that there was like a duality about me. Like I was a hardcore gamer for all of that time. Single player games, though. I just didn't have a social circle or an environment that was really game inducive. So I was playing a lot of games when I wasn't working on, animation or trying to learn more about storyboarding. I just was doing it very solo mode.
Got it. Right. So definitely a passion, but animation and film were kind of your focus at the time. And so, yeah, you went to Cal Arts, and then the start of your career is very much focused on that, right? Script analyst, storyboard artist. So that was was that where you saw your career going, was focusing on that side of the creative media?
Yeah, again, this is like, so at this point, we're in the mid 90s. It was still, I don't think it was as true anymore, but in my mind, it was still the case that like you had to be a programmer. And I did take a Pascal class in college, which for the youth out there, that's a really old pre-C++ language. And so, yeah, I mean, I just felt like filmmaking was the thing that I had learned about and that I kind of knew how to do, and I was getting jobs and paying my rent with and all that. So that really was my focus, yeah. And at the time, I really thought that's where my career was going to go long term, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, storyboard artist, that's a fascinating blend of telling stories, but also creating something right at the same time, creating the art for it.
Yeah, I guess I should say I did technically work on one video game in 1993 or 4. It was called Boogerman, a pick and flick adventure.
Yep.
For the Sega Genesis, I think.
Yep.
But that was that game was being animated in traditional 2D style. So I was actually hired as an assistant animator. So I was working on a video game, but I was using pencil and paper, and I was animating a character, and flipping the drawings very old school style. So
interesting. Did that give you any insight into the video game process at that time, or because it was so traditional, did it feel like, no, I'm just doing the same thing I've done before?
Yeah, I got no insight into the video game. Like we were, I was working for a company that I think had been contracted by Sega to do more than the animation, but mostly provide animation. So like I didn't interact with anyone that was using a computer. I never saw a programmer. I didn't, I was sitting in a converted condo in North Hollywood that was probably not like zoned to be a business, but it was just like there was a bunch of desks there. And like you would come in during the day and use a desk, but somebody else was in there at night using that same desk. So like it was very kind of sketchy in a way, but it was fun. But yeah, it was just purely animators and people drawing and stuff like that. So.
Right, but yeah, working on, even if indirectly, working on your favorite hobby. So it must have been cool to be a part of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So a little brief segue into video game adjacent, but then, a big focus on storyboarding. And then you switch to writer. So you go from Disney Toon Studios over to BioWare. Tell me about that. How did that happen? How did that feel?
Yeah, I'd been storyboarding for years. I had some pretty successful interactions or projects, I think. I also struggled at times. I was not that great at the drawing side of it. I was good enough to get jobs and to communicate what I was thinking. But there are some incredibly talented artists in the animation industry. So I was kind of the person that you hired to come up with fun ideas and business and dialogue and like all of the storytelling stuff. And while I was doing the job of storyboarding, it started to change. When I had gotten into it, it was very like the director and the storyboard artist would sit down with some script pages and kind of like take whatever was best from them and then throw the rest away, and kind of like very loose and creative interaction. But the studios started to kind of like really tighten the screws on storyboarding. They were like, well, we're going to pay a lot of money for these scripts now. We're starting to invest a lot in screenplays. And so we don't want you to come in and start changing our script. We want you to just board the script. So your focus as a board artist at that point became like just the drawing and the craft of staging. And that's all, vital to storyboarding. But it was also the area I was weakest at and that I took the least joy in. So, I had enough of a career at that point that I was surviving. I was working at Disney Toons and all of that. But, or I think actually before my first BioWare, I was at Universal. I was working on the Curious George movie. But I wasn't enjoying it for sure. And I was going home at night and, just playing video games, and thinking how I would rather play this video game than spend 90 minutes watching a film that I had worked on for 2 years. The studios that really had the biggest impact on me were Microprose, Blizzard, and BioWare, because as a professional artist in the 90s, I was using a Mac, and those were basically the only studios that were porting their stuff to Mac, right? And so, I loved Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and I was just playing those. And then I saw that BioWare was looking for a writer. And again, there's a lot of overlap or blurred space between storyboard artist and writer. They're all narrative, right? And so I was like, well, wow, I don't know how to program, but I know how to type. Like maybe and I have been writing. I've been writing sequences and dialogue for over a decade at that point. So I was like, maybe I can do that. What the heck? And they had just released a game, Neverwinter Nights, where they had shipped the tool set with it. That was not available on Mac. So I went out and bought a PC and a copy of Neverwinter, and wrote a module. That was the only way you could apply to BioWare at the time, was to actually create a module. And so I wrote a module and I sent that to them. And the key thing about that module thing is that the month or so that I spent working on a Neverwinter Nights mod is that a whole other world opened up to me. I had bought it with the intention of like, I'm going to learn how to write interactive conversations. I'm going to learn how to hook it up to a character, and that's what I'm going to do. And then while I was working on it, I started to realize like they had this scripting system. You could script different AI behaviors. You could summon events where you would call in effect. So basically, like as one example, in my mod, I had a wizard. You talk to a wizard and they go, well, I got to go. And then they cast a spell and this vortex appears around them and you hear chanting in the background and then poof, they're gone, right? And once I realized you could like start to script behaviors and build an entire world and do all kinds of crazy stuff, I just kind of went nuts. I actually made the mod way bigger than it needed to be because I was having so much fun. So there was a real awakening there. It wasn't just, I didn't do the thing I thought I would do. I did that and much more. So I was really happy when BioWare got back to me and like offered me a job.
Wow, that's so cool. So the power of handing the tools over to the community and letting you that must have been mind blowing, like you said, to sort of go from this, well, games are only made by programmers, to wait, can I do this? Can I actually make game?
Yeah. I created a whole this was so dumb. I created a whole faction in the mod called the Afraid or something like that, and I scripted it so that if you got within 10 feet of them, they would immediately just run away they had nothing to do with the story or the game. They were just a background thing, and I spent like 2 days scripting out the AI behaviors for that because I was just like, this is amazing. Yeah, that's really dumb as I think about it. But
I mean, who hasn't built something, got excited about it, and gone way further than they probably should have done? I mean, we all do it.
Yeah, it's kind of a job requirement, I think.
Okay, so you submit the module, BioWare likes it, they get back to you, and you go through the interview process and land a role, as writer at BioWare. Like, how did that feel?
It was great. There were some difficulties with it, but overall, it was awesome. The difficulty was this: I was in Los Angeles, and BioWare wanted me to move to Edmonton, Alberta, which is extremely far north. I mean, I had served in an extreme cold weather unit in the Army. I had no problem with the cold, although my then wife did. But yeah, we moved up to Edmonton, and I loved the work. So I was writing on Jade Empire, which was one of the last games for the very first generation of Xbox. And it was just this amazing feeling of just coming into work every day and kind of like doing something that I love, which was writing dialogue or coming up with stories and talking with people about that. There were some adjustments because it was games. A game studio looks a lot like an animation studio on the surface, right? There's people in jeans and sweatshirts and like they have dolls on their desk and whatever. But under the surface, it's very different because it's a tech company and an animation studio, back then at least, was not. And so there were just a lot of culture adjustments I had to make and ways of thinking that I had to learn. But that was all good and healthy, and I enjoyed it a lot. I had a lot of fun. Towards the end of my time on Jade Empire, when I probably would have rolled on to Dragon Age Origins, I think, Hollywood came a-knockin' and offered me a job as a supervising director on an animated TV show for, I want to say, triple what I was making at BioWare. And, I had spent all that time as a storyboard artist, and I'd always kind of did the thing that everyone does, I think, where you look at the director and you go, yeah, he or she's okay, but, they kind of could do these 5 things better. And I was like, oh, this is my chance, So I went back. I moved back to LA, went back to Hollywood, directed the show, and almost immediately was like, I've made a mistake. Like, yes, I'm making a lot more money, and I'm getting to direct, but I don't enjoy this. This is not what I want to be doing. I remember showing up to work on Jade Empire and just like loving, loving the actual thing that you do for 80% of your day, or let's say 70% of your day, right? And then I think I can just skip past some things to get us back into games really quick. I spent a few years after that still in Hollywood. I went back to Disney a couple times. Just did all that stuff. But after a few years of kind of going, maybe I should go back to games. The guy who'd been my boss on Jade Empire, Drew Karpyshyn, he was the lead writer. He emailed me. I don't know. I don't remember how things worked back then. I'm nearly sure he didn't call me because we didn't quite have cell phones yet. But anyway, he contacted me and he said, hey, we're just about to ship this game called Mass Effect, and we're starting up on 2, and I really need you to come back because I need you on Mass Effect 2. And I was like, oh, all right, this is it. This is what I wanted. So I went back to games to write on Mass Effect 2 at BioWare in Edmonton. And after that, I have been in games, consistently.
Got it. So you were pulled away by something you thought you were going to love and then didn't. While you were, back, being director, storyboard artist, character design, etc. Did you try and get back into games, or were you kind of caught between, well, I've got a paying job and, do I want to take a risk again, or what was your mindset there?
Yeah, I didn't actively try. I don't think I did. I did talk to Drew briefly when I heard that BioWare was starting up a studio in Austin. So I want to say this is around 2004, 2005. I was like, well, I did hate living in Edmonton. And please, if you're from Edmonton and you want to send hate my way, please don't. I'm not saying it's a bad place. I'm saying it wasn't for me. And it wasn't the cold either. There was some other things about the lifestyle there. But I thought, hey, maybe maybe moving to Austin. I like barbecue. Would be the thing. So I remember I kind of talked to Drew a little bit. He put me in touch with some of the people in Austin. They were a new division starting up, and I got the sense that they were a little like, you're kind of like an Edmonton guy, which I did not see myself as. And so there was like a brief interaction, but there was not a lot of interest. So, other than that, no, I really just focused on film and finding my next gig in film and continuing to pursue that. Until Drew really like sort of did the full court press to get me to come back, which I was thrilled by. It's not like, I don't want to make it sound like he was twisting my arm.
No, it sounds like it was the sort of an offer you couldn't refuse. But it's just fascinating to me that, it's almost like you'd gone back to something you trusted but didn't enjoy, and maybe felt, I don't know, maybe I'm reaching here, but maybe you didn't think you'd get that chance again, and so you just kind of stayed focused on, well, I know this, I might not enjoy it, but I know how it works. Maybe something like that.
Yeah, I think there was a couple factors. I think that was a part of it. I think also that the only contacts I had in games at that time were all in Edmonton. So in my mind, going back to games meant moving back to Edmonton, which was just not. It had contributed to the end of my first marriage, and so I was not super excited to do that. And then honestly, the money was a part of it at that time. When I first went to work on Jade Empire, I took a huge pay cut. When I went back to film, as I said, my salary tripled. And I don't make decisions based purely on the money, but you do got to pay your bills, and And so my first experience had been that I had to really sort of downgrade my life a little bit in games. And one of the things that happened in the intervening years while I was back in film is that game compensation sort of caught up to film. So that made, so there was a combination of things. There was, the financial side of going back to games started to look better. I was really impressed by Mass Effect 1, so I really wanted to work on 2. And for that, and that did involve moving back to Edmonton. And I was in a new relationship at the time, and that period of living in Edmonton actually damaged that relationship as well, although we survived it, and we're still together, and we're happily married, and you've met my wife. So, all of that made it more tenable. But certainly on the more sort of wistful side, I agree. I do think that I thought I had a shot at happiness and I kind of bungled it, and I was like, well, I guess I just got to stick with what I know.
Yeah, I think those are both really important factors that, a lot of people maybe don't think about for us developers, right? Is the relationship impact of, maybe doing a job that you love, maybe working heavy hours in a place that maybe, is more about the job than it is about the location, and the compensation, right? Like you say, everyone has to pay bills, everyone has to live. So sometimes the right role for the wrong money just doesn't work as much as it might be a dream role. And I think those are realities that we all face, at different times, different points of our career.
Yeah, I remember when I was a young storyboard artist, there were these older, more experienced board artists who would always say stuff to me like, never take a job just for the money. And I'd always think, okay, you say that, but you have a 4-bedroom house in Burbank, and I'm living in a 1-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood, which for those who don't know LA, like Burbank, North Hollywood in terms of safety, infrastructure. Yeah. And so I was always like, well, that's easy for you to say. But I do think, at a very high conceptual level, that is true. I think if you take a job just for the money, then you should go back in time and become like a brain surgeon or a lawyer or something, or some other job that you may not enjoy, but you would make a lot of money. If the choices that you made that led you to this creative career, you absolutely, as a person in the world, you have to consider finances and your financial future and outlook and blah, 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 all that. But like, you shouldn't extract or remove the creative fulfillment part of your consideration for the job, because that's why you're here.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah, and it feels like, sort of relating that to your experience, right? So you go back to BioWare, back to Edmonton, but onto a sequel to, a very well-regarded, first game, and, what became a very, very well-regarded second game. So, how did that feel? Kind of, you said you were a fan of Mass Effect, so how did it feel to kind of join that team and play a role in writing how that sequel played out?
Yeah, it's funny because when Drew first contacted me, he said, "Oh, we've just released this game," and I actually had been working on a film in the Middle East, and I had literally just moved back to Hollywood, didn't have a console, anything. So I went out to a store. I don't know if it was GameStop or what stores were around back then, but I rented an Xbox 360 and a copy of Mass Effect and played it. And so then I had a phone interview with some people from the team like a week later, and they're like, "Have you played Mass Effect?" And I was like, "Oh yeah." But it was a great experience playing it. I instantly fell in love with the aesthetic. I mean, I'm a lifelong fan of Star Trek and Star Wars. I don't know if that's weird. But, and I loved 80s action movies, and I loved even the soundtracks. I grew up listening to like Tangerine Dream and everything. So like that, the galaxy map music in Mass Effect was instantly, the first time it came up, I just put the controller down and I just sat and listened to it for a while. So when I got there and I started working on it, I thought it was great. I had access, I had what I thought was a well-realized universe, but it wasn't extensive yet. It wasn't like coming to work on a project or a universe that's been around for 30 years at that point, right? And I was just literally sitting at a desk next to one of the main lore guys. So I came up with, like what I thought was a crazy idea that that, sort of no one on the team had thought of. And I could just turn to the guy next to me and go, hey, this is my idea. It doesn't actually contradict any lore. It's new lore, but it doesn't contradict anything you guys have come up with. And he, took a couple minutes to think about it. And he was like, yep, that completely fits. It hooks into stuff that we've already said. And, so.
That's cool. And were there any, sort of, like you say, you're taking on an IP that is developed but not mature. And does that, you've worked on a lot of IP throughout your career. Like, is there any parallels there or any differences in doing that in the video game space versus maybe doing that in the, the film or TV space?
Yeah, I would say, and this I think has changed in recent years, but at the time, game studios were a lot faster and looser. Think about the projects I was working for Disney and Warner Brothers and Universal. And it was kind of like the studio would define what they wanted. And then you, as a creative contributing to it, your job was to sort of find a way to make what they wanted really entertaining, But you didn't come into work at Disney and say, hey, what if Mickey Mouse has a secret S&M fetish, right? Like you just, not if you wanted to keep your job, you didn't. Whereas, as I'll give you an example, that thing I referenced with Mass Effect, that was my second week. And the thing that I brought up with the lore guy was the idea of Ardat Yakshi in the Mass Effect universe. So there's this race called the Asari. They can actually mate and meld with other species from other planets. And it's kind of like, a nervous systems intertwining. And they kind of can absorb genetic material from other species. And it's presented as this kind of cool melding where they expand their species kind of genetic potential by absorbing stuff from other races. And it's, it's kind of a pleasant experience for everyone involved. And I just kind of thought I could see a variation of that is predatory, where somebody can overload your nervous system, take everything, and kind of just leave you as a mindless husk, right? There was no indication of that in the lore, but when I presented that to him, I said, this is the system that you guys set up, but it could go this way if it was like a genetic mutation. And he was like, yeah, I have never thought of that, but that does fit, right? And so I basically came in and introduced this kind of horrifying predatory behavior that certain Asari could engage in. And that's just something that would never happen in film, right? Like there's too much control. And film just in general at the time was, well, and still is definitely a benevolent despotism in every way, right? Like it is very hierarchical. And on a good project at a good studio, you have a box that you have a lot of freedom in, but that is your box, right? And some game studios are like that, but at the time, at least, there was a lot more freedom to just bring new crazy ideas into the IP. And it's like, if it works and if it's smart and it's entertaining and you can make a good case for it, yeah, do it.
You used the word control there to talk about the movie side of that. Is it control or is it maturity? Is the system in movies just so much more mature and therefore, grown into this more, what's the word, rigid structure, if you like, whereas our scrappy game devs were still a little bit young and kiddyish and kind of winging it?
Oh, I think that's definitely a part of it. Yeah. I mean, in film, people forget that film's been around for over 100 years at this point. And in film, there are still big changes that happen. But really, like, when I got into games, it seemed as if every game I worked on, they had to reinvent the entire infrastructure for how to make it at the start and during and sometimes after. Whereas in film, there was a clear process. When you think about the biggest innovations in film, what do you have? You have sound, color, motion control, which was computers that were cameras that were on a rig controlled by a computer, and then CG, right? And those are some huge changes, but like that's it, right? Whereas in games, it was like every week there was some new technology, something that we could do that we couldn't do, last year. And somehow instead of creating more content, it just meant that the bar for the content we created went up. But yeah, no, games, I used to say making a film is like you get a script, you get a director, you get a cast, and then you plan out a waterfall of events that lead to a film at the end. I used to equate games to you've got 5 boulders at the top of a hill, and you push them all off the hill at once, and they roll down the hill, and at the bottom of the hill, they all crash into each other and produce a game. Like it's,
yes,
yeah, it's definitely a part of it is the maturity and the history of the two industries.
That's a great analogy. I completely agree. It's exactly right. So BioWare, Mass Effect 2, I'm a big fan. Thank you for making that game. I'm a big fan of that game. And then you move over to Blizzard. So you've gone from BioWare to one of your other, storied companies. Like, how did that feel and how did that transition happen?
Yeah, I was finishing up on Mass Effect 2, and I had a great time there. But once again, my partner, my then girlfriend, just was desperately unhappy living in Edmonton, and it was kind of like we have to get out of here. And BioWare was starting up a division in Montreal, and so I talked to them about transferring over there, but I also started kind of applying in other places. And I didn't see anything online about Blizzard looking for a writer, but they were looking for a director for their cinematics. And I thought it seemed very unlikely that they would hire me for that because Blizzard cinematics are very operatic and big. And my experience as an animation director was directing a funny little kids cartoon with bouncy characters, But I threw my hat in the ring. And they got back to me and they were like, no, we're not interested in you as a cinematic director at all. But you do appear to be a writer at this BioWare place. Like, do you want to come talk to us about an unnamed science fiction project? And I was like, I'll take it. Sure. So I, went down to Irvine, California and interviewed and ended up getting the job as a senior writer on StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty. So yet another 2 for me. And I did discover something funny. If you are an American who lived in Los Angeles for like 20 years and then you work a year and a half in Canada and then move back to California, everybody will think you're Canadian for the next 5 years. Like, how do you like the summers down here? Pretty warm compared to Canada, huh?
Yes, I remember. I lived here for a while.
Yes. But yeah, and that was great. A much older, more mature IP in StarCraft, mature in the sense of age, although also much more cartoony in different ways. And that was a very different experience. Within a few months, they promoted me to lead writer. I had no other writers on the team, so I was kind of like leading myself around, but it was nice to have the title. And yeah, so that was a lot of fun. And as a more mature IP, I found that StarCraft did have some more areas where it's like, oh, this is kind of off limits, or this is what the IP is about. But there was an enormous amount, way more than I thought there would be, of stuff where I would go, I had access to Chris Metzen, the guy who had essentially created the IP in terms of lore and world. And I'd go to him and say, like, hey, this thing that you referenced in the late 90s, right? Like, what was your plan for that? And he'd be like, I'm not sure. Let's talk about it, right? And so there was a lot of openness, which I appreciated. And I felt like Chris and the other old school people really invited me in because sometimes there's a thing at a studio with a lot of old school people where they're kind of like, well, we're the real, like you're here to realize our thing because we're the old school. We did the thing 15 years ago, right? And I thought Chris was very inviting, so that was great.
That's cool because StarCraft 2 was kind of a big deal. Like you said, it'd been so long since the first StarCraft that they were finally making StarCraft 2. It's fascinating that that there wasn't you could almost expect there to be more fear of evolving it, right? It's been so long, right? We can't mess with it, right? It's got to be very locked down. It's kind of cool that they were very much like, no, let's expand it, let's grow it, let's bring your ideas. We're excited to make it new and fresh.
Yeah, and I think a part of that was that there was a frustration in StarCraft 1 that they didn't have the budget, the technology, the tools, or the time to do the kind of storytelling they wanted to do. And so 2 was an opportunity to do that. But as soon as you quintuple the storytelling space in a game, you suddenly realize that's a lot of storytelling. You know what I mean? And so here I come, and certainly I don't want to try to paper over stuff. There was certainly some areas, where me and some of the older school people there were at odds, right? Where they were sort of like, well, I always pictured it this way in my head, right? And, so there was a lot of discussion and negotiation and mostly bridge building, right? But within that difficulty, I would say the end result was still that, they were really open to it. And a lot of times with the amount of work involved, it was like, well, if you're the one that's going to be sitting here at 10 p.m. or whatever doing this writing, you're probably going to make a lot of big decisions. So,
yeah, absolutely. And so you're at Blizzard for a while. You were at Blizzard for kind of 7 years. You work on StarCraft 2, and then we worked together on Diablo. How did it feel shifting to another very storied franchise? The third, a 3 this time, not a 2, but still a storied universe that you're kind of shifting over to and playing a role in. How did that feel?
Yeah, it felt great. It was a big change. I mean, Blizzard was big enough at the time, and still is, that I think shifting teams is almost like changing studios. So I had shipped Wings of Liberty, and then we did the Zerg expansion to StarCraft 2, Heart of the Swarm, and I shipped that. And it felt like I felt like StarCraft was in really good shape. One of the big things I felt like I did during the 3.5 years I was on it was kind of try to focus. There was, as happens with older IPs a lot, there'd been a lot of loose ends and a lot of kind of ideas that were maybe half realized. And so I did a lot of almost curating and focusing things. And then, the Diablo team had shipped Diablo 3, and I think there was a lot of criticism internally and externally about the story. They'd never had a lead writer on Diablo 3. They had some very talented narrative people, but they never had someone whose sole job was to make sure the story was great. And so for Reaper of Souls, they wanted to directly address the storytelling problems they had in D3. So they wanted me to come over and sort of wrangle all of that. And it was, I think when I left the StarCraft team, I had one associate writer working for me, and I get to Diablo and I suddenly had 3 writers, one of whom had more game writing experience specifically than I did. So that was a big change right there. And it was kind of a bigger team, different culture, a little younger. The StarCraft team was kind of the original team that made StarCraft in the 90s. The Diablo 3 team was a little more of, they kind of refer to themselves as the redheaded stepchild of Blizzard. I don't know if that was still going on when you got there.
It was. Yeah, I remember that. Team 3 was always the weird Team 3.
The weird team. Yeah. But I enjoyed that. Maybe because I'm weird. I don't know. And the universe change was great. I mean, in games at that point, I had really only been working on science fiction, and I've always loved fantasy and horror and gothic fantasy. So I had a blast. It was a lot of fun. It was just very, very different, and that was very invigorating.
Right, so a healthy change that kind of gave you a new boost of creativity, and by this point, you're like you said, you've got people you're leading, you've got a team. Like, did you feel ready for that when you took that on? Did you feel by this point that you were kind of confident in leading, or was that still new to you?
No, I mean, I had, because I had directed a show years at that point. Goodness, about 10 years earlier, I had directed that show, and I had a crew of about 75 people. So yeah, so I had experience with that. It was my first time sort of leading a slightly bit, well, leading more than one person in games. So there was some stuff that was new to that. I'll give you an example, I think, of one of the cultural differences between film and games is in film. When I was directing, I had some former students of mine from CalArts. I had gone back to teach storyboarding at CalArts, and they were working for me. And they came to me one day and they asked me, like, why don't you like us anymore? And I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, when you were a teacher, whenever we did stuff, you always told us what we needed to fix, and you were hard on us, but like you always told us we were good. And now when we show you our stuff, you only talk about what's wrong, And I said, well, that is kind of the culture in film. Like, no one's going to compliment your work because if you're showing a director a storyboard for $100 million feature, and they tell you this is wrong, that's bad, fix this, change that, and then they walk away, what they've also just said to you is that everything else in your board that I didn't mention, I'm going to put in $100 million Hollywood picture, right? And that's your compliment, but you have to hear it on your own. And games is a little more like teaching. Like you do have to be you're not disingenuous, right? But like you have to kind of like be real about what's wrong and what needs to be fixed and how urgent it is, but also kind of be encouraging. And so that was something I had to kind of like exercise an old professor, college teacher muscle, coming in. I had to remember to break things down in that way. And, unsurprisingly, the super veteran on the team, I very quickly realized with him, I didn't have to do that. I could just be like, yeah, I played it. It's pretty good, but that sucks. And change this and fix that, please. And let me know when it's ready, But yeah, it was definitely an adjustment, a way to think about how you have to approach people. And the other part that was weird about it was I had these 3 developers who were now working for me who had been a part of the wider team for 3 or 4 years, which means they already had their own relationships, and I didn't want to come in and just be middle management, just trying to insert myself in the middle of relationships. So it took a lot of listening and a lot of talking and all stuff that I was like, I'd rather be writing, but I knew it was important.
Yeah, and building a lot of that trust, right? To be able to trust that those relationships are productive, and also trust that you can help and contribute rather than, like you say, get in the middle. So from lead writer at Blizzard, you jump over to narrative director, both at Epic and then at Ubisoft Montreal. Tell me about the transition from lead to director. Like, how was that for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started, I don't remember the first time I ever heard the term narrative director, but when I started, there really wasn't. I had never heard of when I started, say, on Jade Empire, but even Mass Effect 2, and even when I had arrived at Blizzard, I'd never heard the term narrative director. The lead writer effectively reported to the game director or the executive producer or creative director, whoever was really in charge of the creative part of the game. And I think the narrative director idea concept sort of came around. And when I left Blizzard, there were no narrative directors there. I think it came around because of some bigger teams, like at Ubisoft, for instance, where the teams get quite large. You end up just needing a director level person to be the champion of the narrative at that level. They do very little direct narrative work. It's more organizational. But I had already started to kind of realize that if there are narrative directors out there, I need to become one defensively, because there comes the point. This is a really big realization I had about working as a creative. There comes the point where you should not accept another promotion, right? Because you get into something that you love, like say writing, because you love doing it, and then you get promoted to like lead, and now you're like, you still do writing, but you're also doing one-on-ones with people and going to resource allocation meetings and all this. And eventually, and this is what happened to me on the TV show that I directed, if you accept too many promotions, you find that you're not doing any of the thing that you loved and a bunch of stuff that you don't love, right? So when I first started to hear about narrative director, I was like, is that something I want to deal with? But this is the part two of what I just said, is that you also need to rise high enough that you don't find yourself constantly subverting or subjugating the stuff that you know how to do really well to someone who knows how to do it less well, right? So in other words, if I end up as a lead writer working for a narrative director who doesn't have a really strong narrative background, and there are some out there, right? Then every day will be an exercise in saying, hey, I think we should do it this way, and then being told, no, we're going to do it that way, and me being like, okay. So as a creative, you have to find this weird range where like you don't go too high, but you're also high enough up in the food chain to kind of like, do the thing that you know how to do really well, right? And as you know, game development is all compromise, so you still won't get most of what you want, right? But at least you have a voice at the table. So I realized narrative director was something I should pursue. And yeah, I had a couple friends that had left Blizzard to go to Epic, and they were having a great time there. And Epic seemed really interested in me. So I went there. At first, it was not that different from lead writer because Epic also had never had a narrative director. So me and Epic together were defining what it was. But yeah, it was a great experience. It was a very different culture, because if BioWare and Blizzard are tech companies that make games, Epic is a tech company that is a much more tech company, I guess, that makes games that will demonstrate how good its tech is, right? And that's just a very different approach to things. It's not a better or worse approach. But yeah, I had a lot of revelations, a lot of lessons learned. That's not code for bad experiences. That just means as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, that sounds bad. Yeah, I really feel like learned a lot of new things and had a really good time.
Yeah, really interesting time at Epic, with Paragon and, like you say, Unreal Engine really coming into its stride, right? And a lot of software being built to, like you say, demonstrate that engine. And then the Ubisoft role, like you say, direct narrative director tends to be broader than just one project normally. So I'm guessing the Ubisoft role, was a really interesting, broader outlook at sort of narrative across multiple titles, maybe.
No, it was one specific team. Yeah. So Ubisoft was in some ways the most interesting experience because I think I sort of learned, because I don't know this, but I suspect the narrative director role was born and realized at Ubisoft. I feel like it comes from Ubisoft. I can't back that up. And I sort of got to experience narrative director in I think its highest aspiration, in the best form that it could be. So the things that I learned at Ubisoft, so Ubisoft has massive teams, right? They do something that shouldn't work, and it has worked for them so far, which is they'll make a game with 6 studios in 4 countries and a team of 3,000 people. And everything in my background before arriving at Ubisoft tells me that should be an unholy mess. Instead, they were able to make coherent, well-made games on a schedule. And so when I got there, I was learning new stuff every day. I mean, on my 3rd week, a producer or a production person pulled me aside and said, "Hey, we need to talk about what you think your manpower needs will be in like a year and a half." And I was like, "I don't know what my manpower needs will be this afternoon. I can't tell you a year and a half." Like, and they were like, "Well, then you better figure it out. Like, we can give you some tools to help, but like, we need to plan, right?" And the amount of planning and communication and discussion that they have at Ubisoft is just next level, right? And it has to be. Their system would not work if they didn't have it. But, as you know, Blizzard is very much like, I don't know, let's like throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and see what sticks, and we'll go with this for a while. No, it didn't work out. Throw it all away, right? And that just does not fly at Ubisoft. You have to plan and think and be careful. And both systems have different benefits. But working in that format, yeah, I really found that my the experience of leading a narrative team, I think I had like, at the highest, I had like 8 or 9 people, which was the biggest narrative team I'd ever led for sure. It was great in a way. Like, I knew what my job was. I came in, I was in meetings from like 10 to 4 every day. That part wasn't great, but like, my job was to be an umbrella for my team, make sure they could do their job, inspire them when they needed it, kick their butt when they needed it, keep them moving, keep them producing good stuff, make sure that all the other teams around us were getting what they needed from us. It was a very middle management job. So it's not what I aspired to have, but it was a job that I felt like, I know how to do it. And, I feel like I can really help a bunch of people do their jobs better. So, so it was surprising to me that I enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can empathize with this a lot, right? A role that, isn't necessarily as close to what you've been doing for a long time, right? The actual close to the coalface, right? It is, several steps removed from that, but yet pulls on your experience and your understanding and your knowledge and everything you've sort of absorbed up until that point in a way that is it makes you feel really useful, right? Like, hey, I kind of know what I'm talking about, and like I can solve these problems and I can help people be super effective. Like, that can be a really empowering, fascinating role, even if it is, to your point earlier, a long way away maybe from what you loved to do, which was actually be in the engine or be in the tools or, making the actual content.
Yeah. And I think you really come to realize how important it is for that middle management person to have the full context of the thing, right? Because you do, in that role, I had the power to override any of my writers, right? And if I was just someone who was better at the middle management stuff, but didn't have had to maybe done a little bit of storytelling here and there, I could have really like diverted things off in a weird direction, right? And I have been on the receiving end of that, which is one of the reasons for my whole thing about the range you need to be in. You need to be high up enough to prevent that. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then I'm conscious of time, but then you've shifted over into the creative director role. So a role much more focused on the broader project, the broader scope of the game. How's that been? How's that been for you? And how did that transition feel?
Yeah. So. The thing that brought that on was a confluence of events. It's very interesting times. So the project that I was on at Ubisoft, which I really believed in, was an unannounced game. We ended up getting canceled, not, at least this is what they told me, and I believe it, not through any failure on our part. It was just a thing where we were still early on. We were in the conception phase. But to give you a sense of the scale of Ubisoft, we had 100 programmers on our team, right? So we were in conception, and there were multiple other projects that were struggling, and the decision was just made to cannibalize our team, right? Shut our project down, disperse us to other teams that really needed us. And I was asked to move. There was another project that I was asked to move to. But at the same time, that happened in December 2019. So I was in Montreal. My wife was still in LA working down here. And I was like, I think the world's going to end. So I actually am going to move back to LA so I can, when the nukes fall and the disease comes, I can be in my house with my wife. So, I had already had a relationship with this studio, NetEase, which is one of the biggest developers in China. I'm trying to remember how that relationship started. Part of it was working on Reaper of Souls.
I was going to say, was it Diablo? Yeah.
Published our game in China. And I had gone over there and given talks a few times, and we had a great relationship. And they wanted me to come over and sort of help some of their Chinese game teams learn more about global development, how to think globally in terms of the way they approach their projects. And so a part of that was, there's the writer part of me, there's the middle manager, I guess, part of me. And then the other part, I mentioned I used to teach, right? And so I've always enjoyed teaching and mentoring. And if you haven't guessed from this video, I enjoy lecturing, apparently. And so that seemed really interesting, and they were totally fine with me working from LA. So I did that. The title change was so that if I went to a game team in China and said, like, hey, you need to do things differently, I sort of showed up with the credential on paper to tell them that kind of thing. And B, the title creative director is a really strange one in games because it means something wildly different at every studio I've worked at. And what I find interesting about that is I work with some people who they know one definition from their studio, and they're always kind of like begin conversations with the assumption that it means this or that, right? I would say the way they use creative director at Blizzard now, these days, they didn't have them when you and I worked there, but they do now, is really more like a narrative director, right? The way they use it at Ubisoft is more like a game systems director. It's like much crunchier. And I've seen many different variations of it. So to me, it's a good title because I can sort of show up and say, look, this is the stuff I'm good at. This is the other stuff that I'm not an expert in, but I have informed opinions and can discuss intelligently. And all of that fits under the umbrella creative director.
Right. Got it. Yeah. So that's so it sort of almost feels like the perfect role at the perfect time. Like you say, the world was in a crazy spot, and you got to work on some really interesting games. And Narika Bladepoint was a really interesting game that you got to work on, and steer that studio into different development practices.
Yeah. And there's another game, the third of the 3 games I worked on there was just announced last year. I don't remember if that's on my LinkedIn or not. It's called Blood Message. Oh, yeah. And it's a Naughty Dog style game, but made in China and set in Chinese history. So that is a really, really interesting departure for that studio and for the Chinese games industry. So I'm really excited to see how that does.
Yeah, that must have been interesting. You mentioned kind of, the culture shift moving from films to movies, movies to games, and then, working with Chinese studios. I've done that at EA, there's that creates some interest. And like you say, whole new, practices, cultures, ideas to kind of absorb and learn from, but also, meld with, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very different. So a lot of lessons learned. I think that one thing I really value from that experience is the level of communication that you need. Just because you're dealing with people that speak a different language, but also have a very different culture, and then everything you say is being filtered through a translator, who might be excellent. This is not a criticism of the translators, but there's no way around it. Everything you say is going to get kind of flattened down. And so, I've learned a lot of techniques for making sure my communication is clear and crisp and concise. And I repeat the important points. It's a lot of stuff that actually I can take from that and apply to people who have the same language as me and benefit from it.
Yeah, that's great insight. And then you obviously move over to Timmy Studios and look at some different IP. I mean, I feel like that's another interesting role. We are running short on time, so I did want to take a slight detour away from, again, fascinating history. I love, the insight you give on some of the roles has been amazing. Speaking to you, Brian, right, you as a person, making games can be very consuming, right? It can, especially that creative side of you, right, can overwhelm you sometimes, right? It can be so addictive, so fun. Who leads the ship? Is it creative Brian, working Brian, game dev Brian, or is it non-game dev, normal world Brian? Like, who are they? Do they overlap? Do you switch between them? Like, how do you show up in the world as a developer and as a non-developer?
Yeah, that's a really deep question. I think that it's very situational. I think that being a creative in games, so being a creative in a tech-driven environment, means needing to be able to almost partition yourself, figure out what you need to be in this situation, right? So as an example, like when I showed up on the Diablo team, right, I had, I walked in on day one, there was a part of me that was like, I've been playing, I loved Diablo 1 and 2. I've been playing Diablo. Like, I know what we need to do, right? And then I looked around and I'm like, well, I've got a team that already exists. I've got a project that is just starting up and could still, in the blue sky stage, we could go a lot of different ways. But like, I've got a sub team, the narrative team that has very specific problems. And it was like, okay, what defines success here? And also, like, what is the thing that is needed the most? The thing that was needed the most that day was not visionary Brian, right, with his great Diablo idea. It was like team leader Brian, who's going to help sort of unstick the gears and maybe help build up some people that are kind of worn down. And, so I think you have to walk into every situation asking yourself, like, what part of you is the one that is going to do the most good here, right? And that's not always the most creatively fulfilling. But there are definitely times, again, that's why I sort of say partition yourself. I think, within a bigger job, like the Ubisoft job that I described as very much middle management, there were little phases, little boxes here and there where I go, okay, for the next 2 or 3 days, my job is to come up with some really cool ideas, right? And try to do the things that I've always wanted to do or that I thought would like haven't been done before, right? But then when you come out of that phase, part of your job is to hand that thing off to capable people who work under you or work next to you or work above you and let them do their thing with it, right? So there's never the case that you just get to come into work and like do the same thing every day. And that's actually part of the appeal of it to me. Right, is like every day is kind of an adventure.
Yeah, agreed. And does grand ideas Brian or team leader Brian bleed back into home life Brian? Yes,
although I find this is an old joke, but I really find it true. When I'm in a job where my job is to make decisions all day long, at the end of the day, I don't want to like. I'll just go to my wife and go, where do you want to eat tonight? And she'll be like, well, where do you want to eat? I'm like, I don't care. You decide. She's in a phase where she's making a lot of decisions at her work right now. So like if we both end up in there at the same time, we just are going to stop eating dinner, I guess, or eat leftovers. But yeah, I think those things certainly do. Like at work, you're kind of partitioning yourself, but we are all multitudes and we are all still one being at the same time.
Yeah, great point. And has making games changed the way you play them?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd say. I think and it was the same with film for sure. That once you see behind the curtain, it is hard to to unsee. So for me, for instance, as a consumer of RPGs, if I run through town and I talk to a merchant or an NPC, before I worked in games, I think I would think of that like, oh my gosh, anything could happen in this interaction, and like, who knows what this guy will say, and maybe I'll say something that'll piss him off, and he'll attack me. And now I'm doing stuff like, oh, I see where that conversation looped back to the root, right? you know, the best experience is when you can have something that overwhelms you, and you forget about all of that for a while, and you just kind of like fall in as a regular player. But that's pretty rare.
Yeah, agreed.
So beware of working on the thing you love, because it will change your love for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly can. Not always necessarily a negative, but it certainly changes it. Yeah, it changes it to a different. It can never be the same, as you say. And last question, how does your family relate to your video game career? Do they, or do they find it strange? Like, how do they relate to it?
Yeah, I think they find it strange. They are all Northeastern American lawyers, and very like educated, thoughtful, philosophical people. But none of them are gamers. Their kids love games, but they are, they've always been those kind of parents, I think, who are sort of a little more like, well, don't play too many, don't stay up too late playing games. So, I'm very popular with my nieces and nephews, I think. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think there's a sense of respect. I don't know that this is true, but I've always had this sense that all three of my siblings, who are very different from each other, but they all always had this sense that, like, I was the youngest. I was the one who was like preferred to stay home and read books rather than go out and do things, and that that I was kind of like always on this other path from a very young age.
Got it. Love that. Well, thanks, Brian. I mean, I love just the way your career's, ebbed and flowed from outside of games into games, back out of games, back into games. That's fascinating. The insight that gives you, and the comparative understanding of those two, often very blurred. People often think of games and films as so similar, but I think you've given some great insight into how different they can be. So. Great career, great story, very much about what this podcast is about. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And it's been fun to catch up and fun to learn more about you. Yeah,
it's been fun to catch up. And, thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun. And, if you're coming to LA, let me know.
Will do. Thank you.